Welcome everyone for our usual Tuesdays 5 p.m. seminar series. We are honored to have Chris Wildeman from Duke University this week. And Chris is a professor of sociology at Duke. Before joining Duke, Chris was a professor in the Department of Policy Analysis and Management at Cornell. And Chris was, previous to that, was a professor, assistant professor at Yale Sociology Department, where I got the chance to interact with him quite a lot. Chris works in the area of intersection between mostly demography and criminal justice policy and criminology in general. And he's a professor at the Rockwool Foundation Research Unit, as well as the director of the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect. And his work focuses on prevalence, causes, and consequences of contact with the criminal legal system and child protective services. Chris has been quite influential in my life as well, even though he doesn't know as much. He edited the cover letter that I applied to my current job for me and then helped me go through it. And so I owe him my current career, I guess. So he's also one of my TAs when I was learning generalized linear modeling at Princeton. So I asked him a bunch of questions and he corrected my answers back then at Princeton too. So he was quite helpful as a mentor and teacher to me in the past. So I'm really honored to have him in the room. And then he's going to talk today about something that I have been doing a lot of recording today for the master's course that I'm teaching, which is about trust in the state, community engagement, and civic participation. And he's asking the question whether incarceration shapes these outcomes. Floor is yours, Chris. So we all look forward to hearing you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Berkai. Really happy to be here. I will say, as someone who just hates flying and is terrified of it, this is maybe even preferable for me, although I would love to be in the same room as everybody. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of pressure after that introduction. And I also feel like if I tried to teach generalized linear models now, it would go poorly because it's been a minute. So let me start with a couple kind of preliminaries. The first is that this paper is on the short side, so I'm anticipating we'll probably go closer to 30 minutes. Berkai can attest to this, Tasley can certainly attest to this. I have like functionally no attention span, and so I assume the same in others and try to make my talks as brief as humanly possible. So this will be quick, and yeah, happy to chat through things. The other thing I will say, and I lightly hesitate to say this on a recording, but I'm in day 11 of quarantine with my 4-year-old and 8-year-old after a teacher at my 4-year-old school tested positive. So although I always am scattered, this will be probably more scattered than usual. And if you hear screaming in the background, that is because our 4-year-old is delightful, but really likes to scream. So that's fun. And then the final thing is just a little preamble about the project. This is a collaborative project with my former graduate student, Youngmin Yi, who's an assistant professor at UMass now in the social department, and my former colleague, Peter Enns, who's a political scientist at Cornell. Berkai, any measurement questions you have, we will just have to fold Peter in to answer probably. So the final thing I want to say about the project is, so it's a little bit of an odd project in the sense that kind of the core goal is to use associational analyses to try to get a literature that we think has jumped to causal claims too quickly to slow itself down a little bit. And so in that sense, the project is unusual because ideally this sort of descriptive associational broad account based on nationally representative data would have happened first, and then we would have moved toward more sort of causal estimation of specific effects. but instead the literature has proceeded in sort of exactly the opposite way. And so it's an unusual talk in the sense that it's very descriptive, but is trying to respond to this literature that's really trying to be strong. In retrospect, that's like not an easy paper to write, and so I might not have done it if I had thought about that as carefully beforehand. But that's kind of where we are. The other thing is I'm perfectly fine with clarifying questions, and if it's like a sufficiently important substantive question that you feel like you just can't hold it, you can send it over to Berkay, and then if he thinks we should address it now, we can. Okay. So that being said, let me share my screen. Berkay, I can see you, so can you signal me if you can see the slides? Okay. And we recently had a speaker at Duke whose slides did not advance, and we did not tell that person for 20 minutes that their slides did not advance. So if you don't see a logical advance in about a minute, yeah, give me a heads up. Okay. So I already gave a bunch of disclaimers, so I don't need to do those again. The only additional thing I'll say is that this paper is currently under review, but at a journal where the revisions requested are always sufficiently serious that it's almost a complete rewrite. So it's under review, but I would still consider it early in the process. And so any and all comments are really welcome. Okay, hopefully we advance to a slide that says outline. So just to give you kind of a basic sense of what we're going to do, I'm going to give you very, very, very quick background on mass incarceration, and then a very, very quick overview of the existing research in this area. I'm not a political scientist. This is the first sort of paper in the political science space that I've worked on, and so I would need to defer on some of the nitty-gritty details of that literature to my collaborator, Peter Enns, but I will go through things sort of quickly to give you a sense. And then at that point, we'll just drift right into the primary research question, which is on this slide, but I'll read anyway. And so the thing that we're trying to think about is our own incarceration and family member incarceration associated with trust in the state, community engagement, and civic participation in a nationally representative sample. And then we'll kind of run through what we do to test that, and then have very brief conclusions and limitations, because I'll be honest and say I think I have a good sense of what the limitations of the project are, but the big picture sort of implications of it are not yet clear to me. If I can pause briefly, Tassily, I have to say I was totally done at 3, but your kid is so stinking cute that I kind of want a 4th now. Okay, let me run through the background a little bit. So, there are kind of 3 things that we talk about when we think about what mass incarceration is. And the first is that it's historically anomalous within the US sort of context. And so what you see here is panel A. In panel A is what we mean by a historically anomalous rate of imprisonment within the US. Between 1925 and 1975, the US imprisonment rate rarely went below about 80 per 100,000 or above about 120 per 100,000. And since the mid 70s, we've had this sort of massive increase and then slight downturn. The second feature of mass incarceration has to do with sort of comparative extremity. And so what you see in panel B is how the US incarceration rate over roughly a 30-year period compares to the incarceration rates of a whole other bunch of developed democracies. And so what you see there is the US is this, extreme outlier relative to other developed democracies. And it's interesting, if you take the US out and rescale, you can actually see like 4 or 5 distinct patterns among different countries in the incarceration rate, but when you have the US in, all you see is the US as this sort of extreme outlier. And then the third kind of feature of mass incarceration just has to do with concentration. And I guess the way I think about it is built around sort of Becky Pettit and Bruce Western's work, which suggests that mass incarceration, one of its defining features is essentially that imprisonment becomes a modal life course event for folks residing in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage, but also sort of entire demographic groups. And so what you see here is cumulative prevalences of imprisonment in the US, and for the 1975 to 1979 birth cohort of African-American men, nearly 7 in 10 who didn't finish high school had experienced imprisonment by their early 30s, and about 25% of the entire cohort had experienced imprisonment by their early 30s. And so that's sort of this extreme level of concentration. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind here is when folks talk about people who experience incarceration, there's often a tendency to talk about them as though they're sort of social isolates. But the reality is that folks who experience incarceration, just like the rest of us, are connected to families, embedded in friendship networks, and embedded in neighborhoods. And so what you see here is some data from the Family History of Incarceration Survey, which we'll discuss more in a little bit, but it's just showing what proportion of folks have an immediate family member who's ever been, or sorry, these are extended family members who's ever been incarcerated. And what you see is that about 50 to 60% of Americans in a nationally representative study had ever had a family member who had experienced incarceration. So just an incredibly high sort of prevalence. So let's talk a little bit about existing work that's like right in this area. And the one thing I will say is I'm very, very happy to do like a broader review of the effects of incarceration on individuals and on families, and then also sort of some aggregate level effects. But in the interest of keeping the talk sort of on the short side, I'm just going to go straight toward what we know about how incarceration, both own incarceration and family member incarceration, affects trust in the state, community engagement, and civic participation. So if we think about trust, I think the evidence is strong and very consistent. And what that evidence generally suggests is that contact with the criminal legal system, whether direct or indirect, on average has either negative effects or, because very few of these designs let us tease out causality, sort of the best case scenario is that there would be no average effect. There's really, really almost no evidence that contact with prisons and jails increases trust in the state. And so I think in these nationally representative data that we're going to go through in a little bit, we should expect that there would either be sort of a strong negative association or maybe sort of no association, although I think the available evidence suggests that there should be sort of a negative association. Now, when we think about community engagement and civic participation, things become, I would say, both more mixed and also more contentious. And really the whole reason we decided to write this paper was because of just how mixed and just how contentious this side of the evidence is. And so what you see is some folks, mostly political scientists, making really strong arguments that contact with prisons and jails, whether it's direct or indirect, really suppresses both community engagement and civic participation. But it's interesting because in a lot of these papers, you know, they'll look at like 10 to 15 outcomes simultaneously, and only 3 or 4 of them will show any significant association between contact with prisons and jails and community engagement and civic participation. But then rather than focusing on sort of a bunch of null associations, the argument is advanced about there being these like big sort of negative effects that are really consistent. And then there's also been some interesting new work by Hannah Walker. And I think, you know, especially in light of sort of the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of the emerging social movements that we're seeing, this possibility seems even more plausible to me, is that contact with prisons and jails can actually make folks more engaged in their community because they feel like there's a part of the state that they need to respond to. And so I guess what this leaves us with in terms of thinking about the associations we're going to test for is it's just very unclear in our minds. And we feel like, Berkay, I'd be curious to hear what you think of the measures we chose to consider in terms of these outcomes. But we think it's really up for grabs whether we should expect on average to see a positive association, a negative association, or no statistically significant association. And that's sort of really the crux of what we're trying to do here. Okay. So here's the research question again, if folks popped in late or just need a reminder. And I guess the thing we think about this project is we think there are sort of 3 kind of core contributions. The first is that we use nationally representative data. Most of the studies that have looked at these associations are either based on one city or a small set of cities, or based on really specific types of samples that may not be broadly representative. So some of these analyses, for instance, use data from the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study, which is a study that was disproportionately focused on parents who had non-marital births who were living in big cities in the US. And so I think there are reasons to not be completely certain about how representative those data would be, especially for a question like this. The other thing that we do throughout that we think is an important contribution is we're able to consider both own incarceration and family member incarceration. And we're actually able to control for own family member or own incarceration when we're considering the associations with family member incarceration and vice versa. And so we see that as a core contribution because that's not something that we've seen folks in this literature being able to do before. And then I think the final piece is that we're using a really broad range of outcome measures. So we're looking at 13 different outcomes simultaneously. And don't worry, I'm not going to show you tables for all of this because that would be unkind. Even in person, that would be unkind. But I think especially over Zoom, that would be unkind. So in this sense, it's actually a very simple, sort of straightforward, descriptive project. And so let's talk a little bit about the data we use. And I should say these data are publicly available through the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research. They have not been out for all that long. And there are actually a bunch of pretty interesting descriptive questions you can answer about both own and family member incarceration, and using them, as well as there being information on pretrial detention, plea bargains, and lower levels of criminal legal system contact. So, you know, they're out there. We collected them. We're not just holding on to them and not sharing. So please, please feel free to ask questions about the data at the end, and definitely go check them out. I mean, the key thing in terms of the FamHIS is that it's the first nationally representative data set that asks about both own history of incarceration and familial history of incarceration, and develops a new series of questions for asking both about immediate family member incarceration and extended family member incarceration. There are a bunch of other questions, as this study indicates, that you can consider using those data, but the real sort of key feature is that we have these fine-grained measures of contact with the criminal legal system. And if you're curious about the data, I think this descriptive article we wrote is a good place to start and can give you sort of a better sense. But there's also a nice write-up on Roper's website, which is really good for this. Okay, so I'm gonna talk through the own incarceration measure and family member incarceration measures, but for the outcome measures, I'm just gonna flash that slide up there and grab a drink of water while people look at it. It's funny being in quarantine because the only people you see are your family, and at some point you try to avoid talking to them instead of talking to them, and so, like, you know, your throat gets dry after what would be a short conversation before we were all in this mess. So the incarceration question is twofold. So there's one that is own incarceration for even one night. So that's our cutoff, is that you spend at least one night in a jail. And then for family member incarceration, we're asking the same question about exposure, but then we're asking about step, foster, and adoptive parents, siblings, children, one's current spouse or romantic partner, and then anyone else that somebody had had a child with. And I think one of the things that's nice about the study is theoretically, if you wanted to just look at sort of childhood exposures, you can remove, like, we have specific questions about each of the family members, so you can get towards something a little more fine-grained. Okay, so this is going to be the point at which I take my drink of water, and you can look through these. Yeah. So there's nothing more exciting for the YouTube channel than some random dude drinking out of his water bottle while people look at a slide that has 4,000 words on it. I realize that this is definitely not going to be the peak of the YouTube channel. Anyway, so that's the range of measures that we've opted to use, and I think. You know, we went back and forth about whether the trust piece and the engagement piece should be separate papers, because there are very large and very different literatures for both of them, but we decided ultimately that the story is more interesting together. Okay, so I'm not, yeah.
We got one clarification question from someone in the audience, and I have also my clarification questions, if you don't mind.
Ready.
So the question from Marcy Roplat, I think, I'm sorry for mispronouncing your surname, was whether or not an individual voted considered in the outcomes, like participation in the election or voting.
So yes, there is. No, sorry. So we don't have a voting question because we didn't feel like the most recent election had been recent enough that it made sense to ask it. So we focused on these measures instead.
So my question is basically coming from my 90 minutes of recording a lecture today on measuring these exact same of outcomes today.
Yeah.
For my course. So what I have noticed in that measurement literature, people throw in some correlations, a bunch of correlations between these indicators, that they tend to be low. On general, they tend to be low between the people. And then there's a bit of discussion that I have discovered when I was reading it, is very related to the surveys sampling unit, whether it's an individual survey, because these things are usually asked in general social survey, word value survey type of surveys where the household is not the unit that people care about. In those surveys are like collecting information on the households, but they're not really supposed to be on the household surveys. They are usually individualized attitude surveys. So what does that mean at the household level, collecting these informations where households are exposed to criminal justice systems rather than individuals?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think, this is still an individual survey in the same way the GSS is. But yeah, no, it's an interesting, you really, in something like the GSS, you do get far fewer questions about household exposures than you do here. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think through it more. Do you have sort of an immediate sense of what you think?
So my impression was basically the household information that you presented as one of the advantages of the survey may not be exploited as well under these conditions. If this is treated just like any other individual survey, I guess I wanted to know a bit more, what is the advantage of knowing about the household members if all of these things are going to be tied to the respondent in general as an individual? So.
Yeah, no, that's a great, yeah, it's a great question, actually. So, right, ideally, what would be interesting would be having household-based information, both for these questions and for the family member incarceration questions. Yeah, because then you could think more holistically about sort of family level behaviors. Yeah, no, that would be great. Financially, it would have been prohibitive to do that, but I do, I do think it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot more in terms of sort of latent classes. And I think one thing that's really been missing in all the family incarceration literature is this idea that there are actually different latent classes of families that experience similar types of exposures and then have similar types of reactions. And we really haven't, sort of across the board, with the exception of sort of the rich, nuanced qualitative literature, the quantitative literature hasn't been able to tease that apart as well as it should have. So yeah, no, that's a helpful question. I'm glad, by the way, as I move on, I'm glad that these are the measures that you had looked at too, because, when we were designing the survey, there were many things that I had strong opinions about, but with these measures, I basically was just like, Peter, you cannot have more than 10. You cannot have more than 15 or whatever. Okay. And the thing I'll say about the controls is we don't have a tremendously extensive list of controls because the key goal of this study was really to get this first descriptive estimate out there. And so we're able to adjust for gender, age, race, ethnicity, education, income quintile, ever married or currently cohabiting, household size, whether there are any children in the household, metropolitan area of residence, and then also region. We also have supplementary analyses where we adjust for political and religious affiliation. I can show those results as well. I have just an obscene number of supplementary slides at the end. So if you guys want to go there, we can go there. The core reason that those aren't included in the primary analysis is because it became clear that we were a little underpowered statistically, especially for considering the engagement and participation outcomes, when we also included those controls. And because the paper is written up where we're more strongly assuming a null association, it felt like we would be sort of more heavily stacking the deck toward finding a null association than we felt was appropriate. And so they're not there, but I can show you them and they don't really change. I should say they don't really change, and I actually mean that. It's not the like they don't really change and I'm clearly lying, which I feel like sometimes I'm like, those robustness checks don't look exactly the way you described them to me. Okay, methods. Again, this is a very simple, straightforward paper. We're either using sort of a dichotomous logistic regression model, or we're using an ordered logistic regression model as appropriate. Model 1 is just the baseline association. Model 2, we add sort of these core demographic controls, which we're saying core demographic controls is everything except the other incarceration variables. And then model 4, we use coarse and exact matching, which we're saying is the most conservative, but like, you know, we all know that we're just matching on observed variables, and there are a bunch of things that are unobserved in the study. And so, you know, it is more rigorous than the sort of logistic regression models, but, you know, is also, you know, I think we all know that matching is deeply flawed. I wonder if it's okay to say matching is deeply flawed when you're being recorded. I mean, I guess the best way to respond to that is to just say it twice. Okay, so let's go through the results. So, and I'm just gonna go through these as quickly as possible. I turned my phone off, so I don't know what time it is, but I'm gonna assume that we're doing just fine. We're fine, okay, cool, thanks for clarifying. Okay, so I'm just gonna give you a moment to just absorb what's going on here. So what you see is each panel is a different model. And then we have point estimates for trust in the police, trust in the federal government, trust in the state government, trust in the local government, and trust in the criminal justice system more broadly. And so what you see, consistent with what we expect based on existing literature, is that even after you adjust for observed differences, folks who experience incarceration themselves directly have much lower levels of trust in the state than folks who don't experience incarceration themselves. We see this both descriptively in model 1 and then sort of progressively as we adjust. Even though I know that we shouldn't be comparing these point estimates either across or between with any great degree of confidence, it is interesting to me that the association seems to be strongest for police, although I know that we'd have to do a whole big thing. Or let me just say, it's visually pleasing to me that that's what we see. So that's sort of the trust results for OWN. Again, suggests strong evidence of suppression. And for family members, the story is much the same. The point estimates end up being smaller for family member incarceration than for own family member incarceration for most of the outcomes that we're considering, but none of those differences are statistically significant. And so I think there's not sort of too much to take home from that. But again, what we see is having direct contact with prisons and jails is associated with much lower levels of trust in the state. So now we are moving to what I consider to be the more interesting part of the results, because everything we had read suggests that we would see that for trust. When we look at engagement and participation and we think about own incarceration, I realize that visually this is a little much. But for me, the key takeaway here is that a lot of these associations are statistically insignificant and that many of them are also quite small, right? Like some of them, like whether you worked on volunteered for a presidential campaign, the point estimate is large, but really noisy. But I think on the whole, what you'd say here is that own incarceration is very weakly associated with community engagement and civic participation on average. And the associations are not even really in the same direction when they are statistically significant, right? So for donated money to a charity or to a church, you see sort of a negative association. And then for work together with people in your neighborhood to solve a community problem, you see a positive association, although that's only positive after you fully adjust in the course of exact matching model. And I've never really understood how we're supposed to think about associations that emerge only after we've adjusted for 9,000 different things. Okay, so that's that's not pretty. That's the own incarceration story. And then for family member incarceration, we see something that is, again, very similar. We see some statistically significant associations, or we see one just barely statistically significant association for whether you volunteered for a presidential campaign. But in general, it's a sort of ocean of null associations that are not only statistically significant, but where the point estimates are also very close to 1. And so that's kind of where we are in terms of the results. It's funny, sometimes people will be like, oh, this is a really simple, straightforward project, but we think the results are interesting. And then it's just like linear algebra here and like some amazing imputation procedure and all this other complicated modeling strategy. Like with this paper, it really is like we were trying to make a simple descriptive contribution, but that we think is important for the political science literature, especially, and for the sociology of crime and punishment too. So the kind of core takeaways are that incarceration is in fact significantly associated with lower levels of trust in the state. But there's very little to no evidence of the same for community engagement or for civic participation. And I think there are sort of 3 potential implications from this. The first is just that it does suggest that this literature that is really, really blazed through to making strong causal claims probably needs to be reined in a little bit. And then the second possibility is, and we can't address this with the data we have, although if anyone has ideas on how we could think about heterogeneity in the associations, I'd love to hear it. But it's hard to tell if what we're finding here suggests that it's just selection, or whether it suggests that there are actually sort of offsetting effects. And I think there are good reasons based on the literature to expect either to be the case. But I think we're not able to adjudicate between those. There are a bunch of limitations too. So it's an associational study with a causal title. Can't imagine that's going to come up in the review process, by the way. And so we can't make this like really direct critique of existing work that's making causal claims. We can just say, essentially, I would be interested to see how your causal claim could be right if in these associational data there's nothing there. Like what's the, like talk me through how there would be a strong causal effect there. We don't have a large enough sample to directly replicate some of the existing research. I mean, I think if writing papers like this had been sort of the primary objective of this data collection effort, then we likely would have designed the sampling frame slightly differently. But like, you know, in a perfect world, we'd be able to replicate some of Tracy Birch's work that's focused on Chicago. Or we'd be able to nail down to the types of cities that the fragile families data are collected in, right? But we're not able to do that. And then we just had fewer behavioral controls than would be ideal, right? Again, this is the nature of what we saw as being the primary benefits of the data collection effort. We didn't intend to make really strong causal claims, and so we didn't massively overshoot on behavioral controls. We were also worried that having too many behavioral controls would end up leading to bias in our sample due to item non-response, which would be suboptimal. So anyway, that's where we are, and then we have just this slew of other things that we can talk about if anybody wants to see some pretty pictures. But I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and Berkay, thank you for your introduction. It was touching.
Chris, thank you so much for a clear paper, keeping great on time, and we got already 2 questions already in the chat. I'll start from Stevens and then we'll move to Gudon, because
great. Can I ask one question quickly? Is it okay if I stop sharing my screen so I can see people, unless people want? Okay. And I mean, I'm happy to flip it back on, but it's nice to see faces because I only see my family now.
It is.
All right, I'm ready.
So, Stephen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question directly? Rather than me reading out. Now we're at the end.
Thanks very much, Chris, for the talk. Nice and clear, lots of stuff going on there. I'm afraid I'm a boring economist question. I've just simply asked why you're summarizing your effects using odds ratios rather than saying average marginal effects. And I've given a reference to a paper that I'm quite influenced by about that approach. I guess, you know, there are conventions in different disciplines. I know that, but I think I'm right. Well, at least Ed Norton's right.
Yeah, so I hesitate to say this since this is being recorded and Peter Enns is a good bit bigger than me, but Peter Enns is the methodologist on the project and he thinks you're wrong, even though I think you're right. So that's why we've ended up presenting it that way. It's sort of just the usual negotiations among co-authors piece. But yeah, definitely send that along. I think I have likely seen it, but a refresher is always welcome. And yeah, I prefer to see average marginal effects myself.
So Chris, we have a lot of questions. Do you want to take them all and then try to answer them? Can you take notes, or shall I just go one by one? And because now, like we got 6 questions and 2 hands already.
So let's try to do one by one, and I will have my answers be quick. I have noticed that when I try to answer multiple things simultaneously, I answer nothing.
Perfect.
Like I tell people what I had for breakfast.
Perfect. I'll read out the ones that are on the chat box. So Gudon Ju is one of our PhD students asking, can you offer any interpretations that why, according to the results, with such an interaction, people get even lower trusts on different levels of government than prison itself? I just read it out. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, if I can go back to Stephen's comment, I mean, I think it's hard we shouldn't really be comparing the magnitude of the effects across the modeling strategy that we've used now. I mean, I think the core thing I would say is that this feels like new information about the state more broadly and how the state works more broadly. And so it's more instructive there than specifically about correctional systems. But that would be my quick answer.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thomas has a question, and afterwards, Chris Maggio, you can just unmute yourself after Thomas's question. Thomas is asking if I understand correctly, a number of your controls might be endogenous to incarceration, in parentheses, own in particular. So it might not be a problem that you control away some of the association of interests by including them.
Yep, totally. I mean, I think this is one of those papers where we actually tried to model it with like every reasonable set of controls, and the point estimates are just remarkably stable across a lot of different modeling strategies that we don't show here. But yeah, I mean, it is true that controlling for something like income quintile is potentially problematic because that could very well be a mechanism. And so I think the thing I would say is I would be deeply concerned about that if we saw big descriptive differences that then immediately disappeared after we adjusted for factors that could either be confounders or mechanisms. But because the descriptive associations are often statistically insignificant and small from the word go, I'm not as worried about it in this instance.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I sort of had a question about your sort of claims about this data set and what it might offer, because it seems to me obviously causality was one of the main things you're interested in. To my understanding, some of the other main data sets that have been used in this area of research are fragile families and ad health, which are longitudinal. So wasn't totally clear of what you thought the advantage relative to those was. And also specifically about fragile families, you were saying, it's not nationally representative, which is true. But how much do you think that well, one of the reasons that well, it's valuable for a bunch of reasons, the fragile families, but I'm also just wondering if you think that fragile families somehow really misrepresents the characteristics of people who have had experiences with incarceration in a way that your data set does not, because it's nationally representative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Those are all really, really good points. So yeah, I mean, I don't think the data that we're using are better suited for teasing out causal relationships. I just think they're better suited for giving us a descriptive estimate of the associations, which I think is something that this literature hasn't been careful in showing us initially. I mean, Berkay knows this. I wouldn't be tenured without the fragile families data. So I have a lot of love from the time when I used to still try to publish an ASR for the fragile families data. And I think they're a really wonderful data set. I mean, the thing that is really tricky to me with fragile families on questions like this is, it's basically young folks living in big cities in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage, and the policing especially, and criminal justice contact more broadly, that those folks are exposed to is pretty deeply not representative of what folks are experiencing across the country. And so in this specific instance, I do worry about the fragile families data. The Ad Health, I think, is fine for this. I mean, I think Ad Health is really nice for considering these sorts of questions. I mean, for me, the two big limitations of Ad Health are that, you know, it's just one really specific cohort. And so you don't get this broader sense of the association across a bunch of different stages. And then it's longitudinal, but the gaps between the waves are so long that picking out a causal relationship, I know people do it, but it just seems hard.
Thank you, Chris. We have Mary Alice, Marcy, and then Ellen and Johan. Yeah. Mary Alice, would you like to ask your question directly? I'm muting yourself.
Great. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I was just curious, because you talked a bit about wanting to look more into heterogeneities, but there being some limitations. I wondered if you were able to see if it's a family member who's been incarcerated, is it like someone who's close to the person, or it could be like someone who's estranged? And like if you're able to like tease out difference between a close family member versus like a weird uncle who maybe we just don't care about him very much, he's in prison, but who cares?
Yeah. So for for these results, the family member incarceration is only if they were an immediate family member, and so we can't deal with potential estrangement from immediate family members, but we can deal with the weird uncle phenomenon. The other thing that I didn't get into today, but that I think is important, is for extended family members, we specify only that it was an extended family member who you feel close to, which I think is driven in large part by the fact that all of us have weird uncles and weird cousins and other folks who we either actively dislike or who are not consequential to our life courses. And so we thought that for the extended family, we should do that. But yeah, we're not able to dig into sort of how close they felt. You know, that might be wrong. Actually, we have a set of questions that we have a set of questions where we ask about a randomly selected family member who is incarcerated, because we didn't have enough money to ask about every family member who experienced incarceration. And I think in those questions, we do ask how good your relationship was with the person before that, or how close you were to them, or something like that. And so for folks who just had one family member experience immediate family member incarceration, you could actually compare the associations for folks who answered that question about closeness differently. That could actually be fun. The data are publicly available, Mary Alice. Okay, next question.
So first of all, this is an absolutely fascinating piece, so thank you very much. But so I understand that you did not account for voting, which is understandable considering the nature of the last federal election, even though I think it would be really interesting to take into consideration state or local elections. But I don't know if you noticed, for example, maybe within states or within regions, and again, with the caveat that this is not a causational study, did you notice maybe any influence with looking at states that have different voting rights for individuals who were previously incarcerated?
Yeah, that paper is somewhere in the queue and has been languishing. I guess a little plug for the data I would have is there's actually a lot of really interesting state level stuff you could do with these data, but we just haven't gotten to that point. I guess someone did do a very early, like, how strict the states were or how punitive they were on sort of voting, and it looked noisy initially, and then it got kind of move to the side. But I think something along those lines would be pretty great. Yeah.
Thank you, Johan. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask, and I'll then read out Ellen's question.
Thanks, Berkay, and thank you, Chris. That was really enjoyable. I really appreciated it. Chris, the question I'm going to pose is about the slide in which you showed us the wording of the items. Because it seems to me, and you tell me if I'm just splitting hairs here, I'm happy to just take a back seat if so. But it seems to me as though the distinction that you are emphasizing is one of substance, namely the distinction between the topic that is being asked about, whether criminal justice on the one hand and let's just group community engagement and civic participation together just for a moment. Let's call that like civil society.
Sure.
When I could imagine an alternative interpretation of the key distinction here, and it's a distinction of form, namely that the items relating to criminal justice strike me as attitudinal about the relationship I have with a concept like law or law enforcement, as opposed to the community engagement questions, which are behavioral, which are to do with attendance at something, campaigning for something, writing letters to something, donating something, whether it's my money or my blood or whatever else. These are things that one does as distinct from a relationship that I fashion for myself, like, and I could imagine this being interpreted a whole bunch of different ways, namely like my political identity, my social identity. It's how I fashion myself in relationship to these things. If this distinction that I'm trying to flag up holds any water, and I'm happy to have you tell me no, it doesn't, Johan, but if it does, it seems as though one of the cool insights towards which criminological literature, and especially actually much more than the criminologists, the law and society scholars are pushing us towards, is this exciting, like driving a wedge very excitingly between someone's relationship to law on one hand and one's relationship to legal institutions responsible for enforcing it on the other. That people can have actually strikingly different attitudes between these two things. And so I just wanted to flag up, if the distinction here isn't just the topical one, like a substance distinction, criminal justice as opposed to everything else, but rather that your items are actually getting at very different things altogether, namely attitude as opposed to behavior, then it seems that there might actually be a way to interpret these data that is not, as you've argued here, a departure from the literature, but rather actually quite compatible with it. And I was just wondering whether that holds any water in your view.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, if you drink, I owe you a beer if we meet in person, because that's great. I mean, I think, so although it didn't come across in the more concise version of this, part of what we've tried to argue in the actual write-up of the paper is that it would be very reasonable for contact with the criminal justice system to shape the way people think about things, but to actually have no behavioral effect because it's not activating in either a positive or a negative way. That it's enough to flip something in terms of your broader worldview, or how you think about where you fit in the world, but not in a way that ends up being behaviorally relevant. So that's in the very long version of the paper. It's just in this version of the talk, I just try to kind of blow past that, but I'll make sure to talk that up more next time. That's great. Also, this is the first time a question came from someone who went to Berkeley where I didn't actively weep because I was so confused. So I appreciate that.
Too much time spent around Chris Muller. I've had to learn a certain style.
I know, I love that dude, but I still don't understand half of what he says. Okay, so Berkay, are we done?
So no, we have one more question from Ellen, which I've been postponing towards the end. The question is mostly about measurement of these outcomes, and saying that considering that you're asking questions about trusting the police in the survey, do you feel that there was a risk for social desirability bias? And if so, how did you take this into consideration during the study?
So we didn't feel particularly concerned about social desirability bias on that specific question. Although, you know, I will say maybe we should have been more worried about it. I mean, so I didn't get into all these details initially, but we used the AmeriSpeak panel that's collected by NORC at the University of Chicago. And, you know, it's basically a rotating panel where it's nationally representative, but folks complete more than one survey. And our impression has just been that folks essentially just kind of get used to the idea of answering a bunch of survey questions honestly from their experience doing that. I think trust in the police and trust in the state more broadly are certainly not the most sensitive questions that people were asked in this survey. And I think we asked questions about addiction, we asked questions about exposure to violence, we asked questions about, the first question is about family member incarceration. And so we weren't super worried about that, but it's a good question.
So I think we ran out of questions. Chris Maggio had given a citation and a comment, which I can just say the chat and email you all together, and which you can have it. I'll just stop recording. Anyone who wants to stay and ask further questions, I have more further questions. So Chris, I'll just keep you entertained here. But anyone else who wants to stay and entertain here for another 15 to 20 minutes, please stay. Otherwise, you're welcome to leave. The recording stops now.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.